Hello, my name is David Michaels. I'm happy to be with you today. I wish it could be in person, but this will have to do. I'll talk about an interesting and intractable problem. It's important in terms of PFAS, but in terms of thinking about and protecting the public from a range of different chemicals. Dealing with scientific uncertainty is in some ways the primary problem facing environmental occupational health regulators. How do we figure out what we know and what we don't know, what's real uncertainty and what's manufactured uncertainty? I've written about this in my new book, The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money and the Science of Deception. The basic theme of my talk today and of the book is what we face really every day in this question of how do we protect the public. As I write in the book, it's now become commonplace, it's standard operating procedure for corporations to manufacture scientific uncertainty about the harms or the potential harms of the products that they make. A lot of this work is done by scientists, not who are working for universities, though some do, but many of them work for product defense firms. The basic model of this firm is to be paid by a corporation, by a sponsor, to create a report with the result that sponsor wants. You don't hire a product defense firm because you want an honest appraisal of what the hazards are of your product. You hire a product defense firm to produce a report, to produce testimony, to produce something that will make sure that you can continue to sell your product. It's to defend your product. When you think about product defense, of course, you always think about the tobacco industry, and we call it the tobacco playbook because they weren't the first to do product defense, but they did so well and for so long. Even before the first studies in the early 1950s showing that cigarette smokers were at greatly increased risk of lung cancer, the tobacco industry needed to make it look like tobacco was safe. And so they did this sort of advertisement. That became much more challenging though in really 1950 when the first studies came out showing that lung cancer was much more frequent among cigarette smokers. So with the help of the sort of new public relations field and the firm of Hill and Knowlton run by James Hill, the tobacco industry embarked on an initiative to manufacture uncertainty, and it really worked for years. They never said tobacco was safe, but they said, we care about your health, we're going to do the best research. Until then, we're just going to keep selling our product. Eventually there were lawsuits that exposed this whole really ugly strategy, and the one particular memo of the millions of memos that have been uncovered sort of captures this. A famous memo from a Brown and Williamson executive who wrote, "Doubt is our product. Since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public, it's the means of establishing controversy." And that's what they did. They established controversy. Anything that made it appear that something other than cigarettes caused lung cancer, or that there were questions about the ability of cigarettes to cause lung cancer, was what they promoted, what they encouraged. They put out newsletters. This was one of my favorites. You look, lung cancer rare in bald men. Just anything to take your focus away from the prize, which is the relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. That went on for a long time. They actually had to up their game some when it became clear that cigarette smoking not only caused lung cancer in smokers, but in the non-smoking spouses of smokers and in others who smokers spend a lot of time with. And that required hiring more and better scientists, some of the same scientists who then appear in later campaigns, including some of the ones we'll look at today involving PFAS. Of course, tobacco wasn't alone in that famous type of campaign. Climate change is the other one we think about all the time, and that really has gone on very successfully, convincing much of the American public that there is some debate over the science around climate change. Now, here's a memo from the 1990s, which is sort of the beginning of when the fossil fuel industry poured huge money into these campaigns to convince much of the public and to convince especially Republican legislators through giving them large amounts of money that they shouldn't do anything to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere. So here's a memo from Frank Luntz. You may have seen him on Fox News. He's a sort of specialist in words and how you phrase things to convince people to do things. And as you can see, he wrote in this memo, the scientific debate remains open. Voters believe there is no consensus about global warming in the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their view about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. And they did for years, and the industry poured money into convincing people this. This is a small book that was sent out to high school, to tens of thousands of high school science teachers around the country. Came out from a front group called the Heartland Institute, but paid for by the fossil fuel industry. And we're paying for that now. The consequences have been enormous, our inaction on climate change. So those are the two big areas that climate change and tobacco that this has been, but it's used very, very widely, this approach. I call it the Enronization of science. Now you may remember Enron was a company that appeared to be an energy trading company. It was really built on a house of cards. It was fake. When it finally collapsed, there were some people who made huge fortunes, but many retirees lost their pensions, workers were out of a job. And the science that product defense creates is sort of like what Enron is. Scientists hired to defend products or activities in regulatory and legal arenas. This is what product defense is. Next. The value of these scientists is their ability to influence regulation and litigation. They're not there to move science forward. They produce science of questionable value. We do science because we want to understand the world better, to make it a better place for humans and other inhabitants of this planet. That's not what product defense science is about. The science doesn't move our understanding forward. In fact, I think it helps paralyze it. It's marketed to companies, and this is a PowerPoint from a group called the Weinberg Company, the Weinberg Group, and they actually show up in the PFAS story later on, though I won't talk much about them today. But as you could see, here's the way it's marketed. Your company is going to have, your product is going to have the same challenges that face tobacco and asbestos. And look what happened to them. Scare science, the loss of presumptive innocence. So the idea here is your product should be considered innocent until it's proven guilty. And that's really what they sell. Part of what you see coming out of the product defense industry, but also corporate science in general, is something called the funding effect, which is the close correlation between the results desired by a study sponsor and the actual results reported in the scientific literature. And this has been seen really widely. There's tons and tons of studies on this. Here's one example. It's sort of a new one. E-cigarettes. Not surprisingly, if you have an association with a company that makes e-cigarettes, you're far less likely to find that e-cigarettes cause harm than if you're an independent investigator, meaning you're university affiliated or government affiliated, but you don't take money from the tobacco industry. Your results will likely find that there is some real harm. So we see this across the board. What we also see is that industries that need to influence regulation, or industries that need studies to be used in litigation, will pour large amounts of money into science done by these product defense firms that will be published in what I think are questionable or mercenary journals, so they can be used in court. And this is an example. Ford has spent upwards, beyond $40 million on a bunch of studies attempting to show that asbestos in brakes don't cause mesothelioma. And those are studies that are really being done by people who will be testifying in court, and they need the results of those studies. They need to say they're peer-reviewed. What's interesting about this is because we know so much about asbestos, the federal government and foundations, others, they don't fund research into asbestos anymore. We don't need to be doing any more research. We know how dangerous it is. And so these studies really are out there by themselves. There's no new literature saying asbestos is dangerous, and all of a sudden you have these studies showing asbestos is not dangerous. So here's another example of how this works. And this is again the Weinberg Group. This was on their website. It it was only removed when I started writing about it, but they're very explicit. This is exactly what they do. So forgive me from reading the small print here, but they describe their work. And proudly, the Food and Drug Administration is going to cancel a registered new drug. Cancellation requires an administrative hearing. Now, keep in mind, the FDA cancels a drug for only one of two reasons. The first is that the drug doesn't work. If it doesn't work at all, the FDA will not let you sell it. The second is if the harms greatly outweigh the benefits. And they really have to outweigh the benefits tremendously, because every drug has some benefits. So, but if the harms are so huge, the FDA will say we'll take it off the market. So as you can see, the Weinberg Group proudly tells you they were retained by a couple of manufacturers of the drug under attack by the FDA. The FDA is attacking a drug. To define strategy for the hearing, identify experts, that's scientists, to be used in the continued support of this drug, assist in the preparation of the experts for written testimony. In other words, they write the testimony for the experts who go out and front them. Analysis of the testimony of the FDA's experts, preparation for oral cross-examination, and preparation of the summary brief. This led to an extensive process with a written appeal from the first decision, leading to 10 additional years of sales prior to the ultimate cancellation of the drug. So here was a drug the FDA was trying to take off the market, eventually succeeded, but for 10 more years, consumers bought this drug, whatever it was. It's unfortunate, but this is the Weinberg Group, I'm sure, got paid very well for this, and that's the work that's done. So let's talk about some of the product defense firms that work for PFAS. It's worth noting that even some of the employees of these firms will tell you exactly what goes on at these firms. So I went on to the Glassdoor website. That's an app, a website that people who are thinking about going to work for different companies can look at to find what are salaries like, what do people say about working there. So I picked out 3 companies that all show up in the PFAS story here, and a couple of examples of what people have said. So one from ChemRisk, which was one of the first companies that got involved in this, working for DuPont down in Parkersburg, West Virginia, where one of their employees writes, "This is a law consulting company, not a science consulting company. Don't expect to be a scientist." Next, someone from Gradient. Some of the principal scientists have questionable ethics, have been called out for it. And finally, from probably the biggest of these firms, Exponent, sometimes you will be working for the evildoers and trying to make it seem like they did nothing wrong. So those are people who work for these companies telling you this. So this, of course, brings us to the use of product defense in creating uncertainty about PFAS and PFOA, 2 chemicals that we now know a tremendous amount about. So we go back and look at the progress that was made by these product defense firms and what they claimed. It's really quite important to understand. So let's talk about this a little bit. The first episode takes us back to Parkersburg, West Virginia. There were some initial lawsuits. I'm sure you've all seen the movie Dark Waters and know a little bit of the history. But following these initial lawsuits, DuPont recommended that West Virginia hire an organization called Toxicology Excellence for Risk Assessment, or TERRA, run by Michael Dorson, who briefly was President Trump's nominee to be head of the Toxics Office of the EPA. That was not a successful nomination. Dr. Dorson had to remove his name from nomination. But DuPont said to West Virginia, go ahead, hire TERRA and Dorson to tell us what a safe level of drinking water, of PFAS in drinking water could be. TERRA looked at the literature. They put together a panel to do this, supposedly independent, and said 150 parts per billion, far more than the current exposures, would be safe. Internally, DuPont was setting their own limits at 1 part per billion. Of course, they didn't tell anyone that. If you accept 150 parts per billion, then obviously the exposures there would be safe. As things progressed there, DuPont then hired Dennis Paustenbach and his firm ChemRisk to estimate what the risk really is in the population who are drinking this water. Now we know eventually what the risk was, because we have the C8 studies done by the 3 epidemiologists paid for by DuPont and agreed to by the various parties in that suit. Of course, they conclude that it was highly probable that C8 increased risk of a couple of types of cancer, some immunological problems, but the conclusion reached by Chemrisk and Dr. Pausenbach, the predicted historical lifetime and average daily estimates of PFOA of people who lived within 5 miles of the plant for the last 50 years were 10,000-fold less than the intake of the chemical not considered a health risk by the independent panel. In other words, there was no way that anyone had any exposure anywhere near the levels that Dorset and Terra had said would be dangerous. So right there you have DuPont hiring Chemrisk to say, don't worry, nothing's very serious. Of course, that didn't help them in court, and eventually with the C8 studies, they never pull out Pausenbach's assessment again. Now, 3M was eventually dragged into this, and there are some big lawsuits involving 3M. The biggest at the time was the state of Minnesota, where 3M is located, for polluting the water and the drinking supply of people around their factories. So in 2014, 3M then hires Exponent to prepare what I call a strategic literature review. That's a literature review which looks through everything and comes up with the result that you want. And of course, they conclude the epidemiologic evidence does not support the hypothesis of a causal association between PFOA or PFAS exposure and cancers in humans. This is, of course, the opposite of what the C8 studies found, but that doesn't make a difference. They don't really need to look at, do actual studies. They can just review the literature and say, we can ignore those C8 studies because other studies didn't find that. That was published. It's a huge paper. It's 81 pages. It looks very impressive because it's so long. Critical Reviews in Toxicology, and on their website, Exponent boasts that is the most downloaded paper, the most, maybe not downloaded, but the most examined paper, 22,000 hits of any paper in that journal, which publishes a lot of stuff just like this. That continues. NTP, EPA, the National Toxicology Program, NTP, start looking at the various PFAS compounds, and they're going to issue various deliberations around those. And so, of course, they hired Gradient in this case, another consulting firm. This went up in Cambridge, and they criticize NTP's analysis. They say it's biased, and that the animal and human evidence does not support NTP's conclusions, and we shouldn't call these chemicals so hazardous. They also hire Exponent, the same people who wrote that report a couple of pages ago, to issue a report in that suit, and they say the overall weight of the evidence is not sufficient to demonstrate a causal association between PFAS and all sorts of different health outcomes. Whatever it is, PFAS doesn't cause it. And they hire Gradient to issue another expert report in that lawsuit saying the levels of exposure don't present a toxicological concern. Just like in West Virginia, I think the company realized those reports will not convince a jury of anything. They're done clearly for mercenary reasons. 3M settled the suit with Minnesota. They paid $850 million. But those reports are still out there, and they will be used again in different reports. So that's where we are with PFAS, but that same approach is taken across the board, and it really threatens public health. And what I talk about in my book is how the same people who are doing that work for PFAS and the same approach has an impact on our air, on our water. It promotes the use of opioids, selling sugar and promoting the obesity epidemic. The lead industry uses it to defend their product when people say that low levels of lead cause pediatric neurological development problems. The alcohol industry uses them. The approach is used by the National Football League and for 10 years denying the existence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I think it has an impact not just on public health, though that's important enough, but also on how people think about science and think about scientists. It really hurts the credibility of all scientists. So, when we think about what this all means, beyond hurting public health and hurting science, who's paying the price for this? Well, first of all, obviously, people who are sickened by exposures that should have been prevented. we shouldn't have to wait to find out how dangerous these chemicals are. When there are indications, we need to protect people. And there are a lot of people who have been needlessly sickened because they haven't been protected. What's interesting is in many cases, shareholders, well, maybe not many cases, but occasionally, shareholders pay the price when corporations are caught doing this sort of manipulation of the scientific evidence. One example, it's been in the news quite a bit, is Johnson & Johnson and their product baby powder or body powder, which is a talcum powder. A talc is mined with asbestos. It's very unusual to get talc which is asbestos-free. J&J has claimed since the 1970s there is no asbestos in their talc, but there have been mineralogists who have been demonstrating that there is asbestos contamination really since Dr. Solikoff's lab looked at this in the mid-1970s. So sometime last year, J&J actually had to recall 33,000 bottles of baby powder after asbestos was actually found in the one baby powder sample. J&J claimed it was actually from a malfunctioning air conditioner, but they still recalled quite a bit of the product. And they had to, really, because there have been these lawsuits which are being raised by women with ovarian cancer. There have been quite a few studies now showing ovarian cancer is associated with the use of talcum powder. There are studies that show it's not associated. There's a reasonable scientific debate over that question. In Missouri, there was a lawsuit involving 22 women who sued J&J claiming their ovarian cancer was caused by Johnson's baby powder. I should say that I was a fact witness, not an expert witness, but actually I was subpoenaed to be a fact witness in that trial, so I got to see some interesting documents that I talk about today and I wrote about in my book. The jurors looked at the evidence, and first the question of, did the talc exposure cause ovarian cancer? The jurors said yes, and they awarded the women $25 million each, or $550 million, and that's quite significant. But more significantly, they looked at the documents that J&J gave up in the discovery, and they showed that J&J, other talc firms, the trade associations, worked very hard to convince the US government not to label the products containing talc as potentially carcinogenic. And this is really of interest to those of us in public health, saying once we discover something could be causing illness, we need to warn people. So the National Toxicology Program, the Board of Scientific Counselors, which I'm currently a member of, actually considered categorizing asbestiform talc as a human carcinogen, talc with asbestos as a carcinogen, and non-asbestiform talc as reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen because it could have asbestos. The talc producers and their users of talc, including Johnson & Johnson, hired some of the same people who had worked for tobacco for years to oppose that categorization. And the documents really, the memos are shocking. They described their objective here was to create a reasonable doubt in the minds of the members of the Board of Scientific Counselors. In fact, very specifically what they said was we have to come up with more confusion. And they did. The NTP pulled back its designation, and so it was never labeled as a carcinogen. When the jurors heard that, they were clearly influenced by Johnson & Johnson's behavior, and they awarded these women $400 billion in punitive damage. And that's being appealed, but that's really sending a message. That's what the jurors want to do. They were trying to say something to Johnson & Johnson that Johnson & Johnson would feel. Now, so that has impact certainly on Johnson & Johnson. Their market value decreased about $50 billion, not just because of that suit, but several suits. They're facing more than 14,000 cases of women with ovarian cancer alleging that their cancer was caused by exposure. And finally, just a few months ago, they pulled talc-based baby powder from the market in the United States and Canada. They're going to sell baby powder, but it turns out it doesn't have to be made with talc. You can make it with cornstarch and other things, and therefore it's safer. They could have done this 20 years ago, but they didn't. So when we think about this, I think we have to look at our regulatory system, the failure to protect women from baby powder with talc, the failure to protect the residents of Parkersburg, West Virginia, or Minnesota, or much of the country now from PFAS contaminations. Our regulatory system has not really worked very well. It's gotten worse under President Trump, but it wasn't working very well before. So now we have to rebuild our system of public health and environmental protections. The EPA has lost a lot of its best people. A lot of regulations have been rolled back. OSHA has lost some very good people. We have to think about how do we rebuild the system of protections, but we can't think about going back to where we were before. We have to figure out what are the principles to apply. And the first principle is we have to protect the public using the best evidence available now. Even though there's uncertainty, we have to be able to separate out that real uncertainty from the manufactured uncertainty and say, given uncertainty, we can't wait until people die before people get sick, what we sometimes call the body in the morgue method. We have to protect people now. We also have to make sure we don't make the same mistakes we made in the past. We can't let, for example, companies do their own oversight of safety and the government outsource that. That was a problem, for example, with the Boeing 737 MAX, where the FAA said to Boeing, you figure it out, we won't oversee your safety. And 350 people were killed in 2 plane crashes, and they're still not able to sell that plane. So everybody's paying the price of that. So how are we going to avoid making those mistakes? The first is we have to build structures, regulatory structures, that deter agency capture, where the regulated party owns the agency, and the revolving door where people go in and out. As I said, we've got to recognize the existence of real uncertainty, understanding and separate that from the manufactured or fake uncertainty. And we've got to build the evidence base with research produced by unconflicted scientists who aren't working for companies, who have no reason to be influenced by their money. So how do you do that, unconflicted research? Well, I think what we have as a principle is that the polluters and producers of hazardous chemicals must pay for the research, but they shouldn't control it. We need to have the research directed by independent, unconflicted scientists. There are some other past mistakes we need to avoid. We have to think about regulating toxic chemicals as a class, not one by one. And PFAS is the best example. Last I read, there were 4,500 different perfluorinated compounds in this category of chemicals, and we have reasonably good human evidence on a handful at most. So we're just going to wait to see if more people get sick before we regulate those. We have to take each class of chemicals and regulate them as if they're all dangerous, unless there's clear evidence that some are safe, and we certainly don't have that with the PFAS compounds. We also have to recognize that the model of presumed innocence that I talked about at the very beginning doesn't apply. That works for people in the criminal justice system. They should be innocent until proven guilty, but chemicals are not innocent until proven guilty. We have to assume that they are dangerous until we have affirmative evidence that they're safe. We have to end the presumption of innocence. And finally, 2 ideas. The first is, now is the time to be bold. The country is changing rapidly. We have to move forward, and most importantly, we have to work together to get there. We have to organize. So thank you all very much, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.